Actress Shelley Duvall has passed away. Duvall died of complications from diabetes at her home in Texas. She was 75 years old. At 74, Shelley Duvall broke her silence about Stanley Kubrick. For 44 years, she never told the full truth about The Shining. The 127 takes that made her hands bleed. The 12 hours of crying every day. The clumps of hair falling out from stress. Everyone knew it was brutal, but what Shelley revealed in her final interview was darker than anyone imagined. She talked about what happened between those takes, what Kubrick made her do when the cameras stopped rolling. The secret that haunted her for decades is finally out. Shelley Duvall was born on July 7, 1949, in Fort Worth, Texas. She was the first child of Bobby Ruth Crawford, who worked in real estate, and Robert Richardson Duvall, who had once been a cattle auctioneer, but later became a lawyer. Her early years were full of constant moving from one Texas town to another. Her father's insurance job was unstable, so the family often lived in hotels until they finally settled in Houston around 1954. Shelley was 5 when they found some stability, but life in their household was anything but quiet. She was the only girl with 3 younger brothers. Scott was born in 1955, Shane in 1957, and Stuart in 1959. That loud, chaotic energy shaped her bold personality. Her parents named her after the famous writer Mary Shelley, but there was nothing artistic in their careers. They eventually divorced in 1973, and her father died in 1994 at age 74. By 1960, Shelley had already watched her father shift from auctioning cattle to practicing law. This constant change gave her a deep resilience, but also made her feel isolated. She didn't grow up around the arts, and the only time she stood on stage as a child during a 6th-grade talent show in 1961, she forgot the lines of a poem and ran off embarrassed. Strangely enough, by 17 in 1966, she was already modeling at Neiman Marcus, showing early signs of charm she didn't even know she had. By the time she was 10, around 1959, Shelley was already trying to make something of her own. She created a homemade lip gloss called the Pink Stuff using petroleum jelly and food coloring and sold it door to door in Houston for spare change. Her mother called her Manic Mouse back in 1955. Not just for her wild energy, but because she couldn't sit still, constantly knocking things over while racing through the house. At 12 in 1961, she was already reading Grimm's fairy tales and stories like The Wizard of Oz. Her bookshelf had over 20 books, and she made up her own stories too, long before anyone thought she'd one day produce fairy tale shows. That same year, the talent show disaster left a mark. Parents in the crowd whispered that she'd never make it in entertainment. Still, in 1963, she joined the school choir, often biking around Houston with kites and headphones, listening to the strange, dreamy music of the 60s. She had no formal art training, but she was always sketching. At just 6 years old, she'd sit in the grass and draw insects, sometimes making over 50 detailed bug sketches in one go. By 1965, she dreamed of becoming a scientist, but even then, people didn't quite get her. She was a strata student, yet daydreamed so much in class that classmates thought she was weird. When she graduated from Waltrip High School on June 5, 1967, she still had no plans of being an actress. She enrolled at South Texas Junior College to study nutrition and diet therapy, hoping to become a scientist. Her dream crashed hard in 1968 when she watched a lab experiment where they cut into a monkey's brain while it was still alive. The horror of it made her leave college that very day. From 1967 to 1969, she paid her bills by selling scarves and perfumes at Foley's department store, making around $200 a month. Even before high school, she was excelling in science. At Frank Black Middle School, between 1960 and 1963, she once scored 98% on a biology exam while doodling bugs in the margins. She'd been collecting insects since 1957, and by 1965, had gathered over 100 different specimens. But the monkey vivisection on October 15, 1968, ended all that. She said she felt like she was floating through life after that, drifting until something unexpected pulled her into a world she'd never planned for. right after high school. She was still just 17. Shelley married a photographer named Bernard Sampson on December 2, 1967. The wedding was small, just 50 guests. Her parents were surprised, but eventually gave their blessing. They had met in 1966 during one of her short modeling gigs at Neiman Marcus. He was 25 when he took her picture, and they quickly fell into a whirlwind romance. In 1970, she threw a party for him in Houston to show off his artwork. That night, someone on Robert Altman's film crew saw her. That moment changed her life forever. By 1972, she was filming Brewster McCloud, and the tension between her rising fame and her marriage was starting to show. Sampson didn't like how close she was getting to her co-stars. She was paid $5,000 for her first big acting role, more than what he was making. The marriage ended officially on March 15, 1974. Court papers were filed that January, citing irreconcilable differences. Shelley was heartbroken. Years later, in a 2012 interview, she said losing her first love at just 24 was one of the hardest things she ever faced. Her discovery by Robert Altman felt like something out of a movie. On April Fool's Day in 1970, she hosted that now famous party in Houston for Bernard's art, and Altman's crew was there scouting for a film. Altman himself was drawn in by her strange magnetic energy. He pretended to be interested in art just to get her to do a screen test. She didn't want to act. She said she wasn't an actress, but Altman saw something rare. He cast her as Suzanne Davis in Brewster McCloud, where she played a quirky tour guide inside the Houston Astrodome. The movie came out on December 5, 1970. It flopped at first, but later became a cult classic. Shelley flew around the country doing press for it. She appeared in Vogue and Show magazine. It was her first time leaving Texas. Altman would later admit he didn't realize she wasn't acting. He thought her unique personality was a performance. But he also called her magic. The next year, she was cast in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, playing a mail-order bride named Ida Coyle. The film was shot in a freezing, muddy Canadian mining town. Released on June 24, 1971, the movie was dark, raw, and different. It made $8.2 million from just a $2 million budget. Shelley played a woman whose husband dies, leaving her to survive alone in a rough place where women were often sold like property. Her character was bought for $1,500. The role showed a different side of her. She wasn't just quirky anymore. She could do serious drama. Critics noticed how well her face fit into the time period. Even though she was so modern in real life, she hadn't even auditioned formally. Altman cast her based on instinct in 1974. While filming Thieves Like Us in Mississippi, Shelley had to film a scene where she almost drowns. She played Kichi, a young woman in love with a criminal. The director made her do the river scene over and over, and the water was full of insects and dirt. She was only 24, but it wore her out completely. Co-star Keith Carradine said she had an enchanting aura, but the truth was, she left the set exhausted. The film came out on February 11th, 1974, and while it didn't make huge money, critics loved her performance. She would later win Best Actress at Cannes for another Altman film. But this was the beginning of her pattern roles that demanded everything from her body and mind. And it wouldn't be the last time she was pushed to the edge. In Nashville, released on June 11, 1975, she played Leigh Joan, a shallow groupie in high heels and short shorts. The role shocked people. She ignored her dying aunt in the film just to chase after country music stars. To prepare, Shelley spent days observing real groupies in Nashville bars. The film followed 24 characters over 5 days and ended in a violent concert at the Parthenon. It was huge, winning an Oscar for Best Original Song and making $10 million. Shelley's character flirted constantly and stumbled around chasing fame. Her performance was totally unscripted. Everything she did came from her own instincts, her clacking heels, her fake laughter, her blank stares. It all felt disturbingly real. Critics said she managed to make cruelty and comedy blend together. In 1976, she started dating musician Paul Simon. They lived together for 2 years in her Hollywood home. But everything changed when she introduced him to her friend Carrie Fisher in 1977. Fisher was just 21. Fresh off her Star Wars fame, Paul Simon was 36. He left Shelley suddenly and moved in with Carrie. It broke Shelley's heart. She said later that the pain from that betrayal stayed with her for years. She poured it into her acting. When she filmed The Shining in 1980, she was crying constantly on set, listening to sad music on her Walkman. Simon would eventually marry Fisher in 1983 after a rocky relationship. Shelley never forgot how fast things ended. In 1977, Shelley Duvall was 27 years old and relatively unknown when she walked into the Cannes Film Festival and left with the Best Actress award. The film was Three Women, a haunting tale directed by Robert Altman, who wrote the role of Millie Lamoureux after dreaming about her. What made it even more surreal was that much of the script was improvised, including lines Shelley made up on the spot while filming in a dusty California town. She played a lonely, chatty spa worker obsessed with magazine recipes, and somehow that quirky performance lit up the screen. Critics called it brilliant. The film came out in April 1977 and made less than $2 million. But it didn't matter. On May 27th, Shelley tied for Best Actress at Cannes, and suddenly, the world noticed. She got a BAFTA nomination and won the Los Angeles Film Critics Award. That moment turned her from background actress to breakout star. Just a month earlier, on April 20th, Shelley had delivered a wild one-day cameo in Woody Allen's Annie Hall. She played Pam, a Rolling Stone writer who hooks up with Alvy Singer, and then tells him that sex with him felt like a Kafka-esque experience. It was absurd and hilarious and lasted under 2 minutes, but the way she delivered that line stuck with people. It was filmed in a single take on May 19, 1976, and even though it was short, it gave her more exposure just as the movie went on to win Best Picture in March. 1978. Woody Allen had actually written the part just for her after seeing her in Altman's movies. That kind of oddball charm, the kind that made sex sound like surreal poetry, helped cement Shell's place in pop culture. A year earlier, in 1976, she did something almost no actress would dare. On December 5th, in a pub special based on F. Scott Fitzgerald's Bernice Bobs Her Hair, Shelley actually cut off her real hair live on camera, shearing 12 inches off in one take without a stunt double. She fully became Bernice, a shy girl, humiliated and into jetting a bob during a scandalous party. Back then, bobbing your hair wasn't just a style, it was a statement, and Shelley went alien. Critics were shocked. Shelator said the experience left her emotionally raw, and it showed on screen. That short film directed by Joan Micklin Silver captured a transformation that felt painfully real, hinting at how far Shelley would go for a role. By May 14, 1977, she had gone from indie darling to national figure. That night, she hosted Saturday Night Live and brought her offbeat humor to millions of viewers. She sang glam rock and glittery outfits with Gilda Radner and Jane Curtin. She played a cult member in a sketch called Night of the Moonies. Andy Van threw in improvised lines based on her Texas childhood. One sketch had over 300 extras. The ratings hit 12 million. But behind the scenes, she weighs exhaust. She was flying between film sets, interviews, and live tapings. Still, she powered through, and it became one of the most memorable episodes of the show's experimental era. 2 years later, in 1979, something changed. Shelley decided to create something entirely her own. On the set of Popeye, while reading fairy tales between takes, she got the idea for fairy tale theater. She pitched it, produced it, and even hosted every episode. The show launched on Showtime in 1982 with Robin Williams as the Frog Prince and ran until 1987. Brought in stars like Mick Jagger and Jeff Bridges. But it was Shell who gave it that strange, whimsical soul. She used over-the-top costumes, creepy puppet-like sets, and a budget of $5 million per season, which she scraped together from deals with Gaylord Productions. It was a hit with kids and critics, winning a Peabody Award in 1985 and earning Emmy nominations. But underneath the magic, Shelley was still healing from the scars left by Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Back in 1980, she had played Olive Oyl in Popeye, the role everyone said she was born to play. The set was a massive seaside village in Malta. built from scratch with thousands of gallons of imported paint and tons of nails. It was scattic. She had to sing songs by Harry Nilsson, perform slapstick scenes, and endure weather so harsh that floods delayed filming. Kids had teased her as olive oil in school, and now here she was, living it for real. Robin Williamson's got hit in the face with a spinach can. The whole shoot was madness, but Shelley stuck it out even through the injuries and exhaustion. In 1981, Jawstone, year after Popeye, she appeared in Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits, a dark fantasy where she voiced a character named Pansy. The film became a cult classic, making $36 million on a $5 million budget, but behind the scenes, it was chaos. Gilliam's unpredictable direction meant scenes changed constantly, and once he even fell through a roof near Shell during filming. This was right after her ordeal with The Shining, where she had spent 56 weeks on set, crying for 12 hours a day, doing over 120 takes of a single scene, and losing clumps of her hair from stress. Still, she kept showing up, and somehow managed to survive it all. By 1985, she created another show, Tall Tales and Legends. It aired 9 episodes until 1987, each retelling American folklore like the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Shelley hosted, produced, and even directed parts of the show herself, often cutting costs by paying actors the lowest union wages. She filmed in real foggy woods, worked 15-hour days, and controlled every detail. It was nominated for a Primetime Emmy in 1986. Her perfectionism made the shoots run over budget, but it also gave the show a rare magic that inspired generations of kids' TV. In 1987, she appeared in Roxanne, a romantic comedy with Steve Martin. At first, things went well. She played Dixie, the quick-witted friend, and Thebentor was sharp. But behind the scenes, Shelley and Steve clashed. He kept tolerating lines, and she pushed back. Arguments got so heated that filming stopped more than once. They had been friendly off-screen, but on set, the tension was real. Still, the movie made $40 million and reminded everyone of Shell's dry, deadpan humor. In 1990, she took things even further with Mother Goose Rock and Rhyme. She played Little Bo Peep in a musical chaos of live sheep, wild costumes, and rock and roll nursery rhymes. It had 47 speaking roles, 32 sets, and prosthetics that took hours to apply. The production was delayed by 3 weeks and went $150,000 over budget, but it premiered to 5 million viewers. Shelley micromanaged everything and even coaxed child actor scenes when they froze. It was a fever dream, but it was her vision. By 1991, she appeared in Suburban Commando with Hulk Hogan and Christopher Lloyd. The movie was ridiculous. Alien bounty hunters, arcade fights, even a young Undertaker. But Shelley improvised her scenes, adding warmth and wit. It only made $8 million, but fans loved it for how strange it was. That same year, she starred in a PBS movie called Frogs, where she rescued animals both on and off screen. She personally handled over 100 frogs in one scene and spent the shoot saving stray cats and dogs around the set. It cost the crew $20,000 in delays, but it was pure Shelley. She loved animals more than fame. Behind the scenes, her production company, Think Entertainment, was collapsing. By 1988, she was deep in debt. After overextending on kids' shows, she bought out her partners in 1990 and worked 15-hour days. But the recession hit hard. Costs ballooned. She went from making $100,000 per movie to living off a small Social Security check. She sold props and memorabilia just to stay afloat. In 1993, she sold half the company to a British firm to survive. By 1996, she appeared in The Portrait of a Lottie, one of her last major roles. She played Countess Gemini alongside Nicole Kidman. They bonded over shared pain from working with obsessive directors. Shelley had never really recovered from The Shining. This quiet period drama reflected that slow unraveling. The film didn't do well, but it was personal. In 1998, she played a controlling mother in Home Fries, a dark comedy with Drew Barrymore and Luke Wilson. The film flopped, and by then Shelley was disappearing from public view. Agoraphobia had taken over. She turned down every role after that, and in 2002, Manna from Heaven became her last film for 20 years. It earned less than $500,000. But the real story was her vanishing act. She moved to Blanco, Texas, and started saying she believed the FBI or aliens were watching her. In 2016, she appeared on Dr. Phil in a controversial interview that left fans' heart broken. In 2023, she attempted a comeback in a low-budget horror film called The Forest Hills. She played a fragile mother in a werewolf story. But it wasn't just Thurl that felt haunted. Shelley was sick. Diabetes had weakened her, and she struggled during filming. It was her first film in 2 decades. Shelley Duvall met Dan Gilroy in 1989 while working on a quirky TV musicale called Mother Goose Rock and Rhyme. What began as a creative partnership quiet lightened into something much deeper. While the rest of her world felt like it was constantly shifting, Dan became the one person who never left. For 35 years until her final breath in 2024, he stood by her side through everything. When Shelley decided to leave Hollywood behind in the mid-1990s, it was Don who moved with her to Blanco, Texas. There, far from the spotlight, he built a home studio just for her. A little safe haven where she could paint, sing, and just be herself again. It wasn't just love, it was survival. Her struggles with mental health were no secret. Dan often became her anchor when delusions took over. In 2021, he admitted that she sometimes believed aliens were watching her. She would flash her car lights at night, thinking she was signaling them. To the outside world, it seemed bizarre. But to Dan, it was just Shelley, and he never let go. Even when the world turned its back on her after that infamous Dr. Phil episode in 2016, Dawn stayed. She passed away on July 11, 2024, at 75 from diabetes complications. And it was Dan who broke the news. The love never cracked, even when everything else did. That 2016 Dr. Phil appearance shocked millions. Shelley was 67 when she sat on that couch and said things that made the audience shift uncomfortably, claims of a disc implanted in her body of Robin Williams, still being alive as a shape shifter, and of being hunted by the sheriff of Nottingham. She looked into the camera and said, "I'm very sick. I need help." It should have been a cry for compassion, but instead the show aired it as entertainment. The backlash was fierce. Stars like Mia Farrow and Vivian Kubrick called it cruel. Shelley would later say she felt manipulated and regretted ever agreeing to it. By then, she was living on $160 a month from Social Security. Her brother's cancer diagnosis in 1995 had already pulled her deeper into isolation. That episode was just another scar. The spiral had started years earlier. After the 1994 Northridge earthquake destroyed her Los Angeles home, she never quite returned to the life she once had. Her health problems worsened in the 20110 South when she was diagnosed with diabetes. The disease took its toll slowly and painfully. A foot injury robbed her of mobility. Her weight climbed to over 200 pounds. By 2023, she needed hospice care. She had tacted since 2002, but she came back one last time for the Forest Hills in 2023. That short return was bittersweet because the very next year, diabetes claimed her life in the home she shared with Dan. He said she died peacefully in her sleep, but the years before that were anything but peaceful, even as her health faded. Shell's mind wandered into places that were hard to understand. She often spoke of UFOs circling her Texas ranch. In one 2009 interview, she casually described them as all over Theplis. Neighbors said she boarded up a hole in her backyard, convinced it was a portal to another dimension. She kept dozens of birds, dogs, even reptiles. Her world had shifted so far from the Hollywood soundstages she once ruled. And yet, even as these beliefs grew stranger, they always seemed to connect back to something deeper. Childhood memories, fear, maybe even trauma. She was born on July 7, 1949 in Houston. Those UFO stories, she sadly started when she was a little girl. But Shelley Duvall wasn't always the reclusive figure tabloids made her out to be in 1980. she stood face to face with one of cinema's most terrifying characters, Jack Nicholson's Jack Torrance in The Shining. She didn't just play Wendy Torrance, she lived her. Preparing for the role, Shelley read Stephen King's novel over and over, trying to understand Wendy's fear. What she didn't know was that Stanley Kubrick had other plans. He rewrote her role almost daily. What began as a calm, resilient wife on paper became a frantic, trembling figure on screen. Shelley had to adjust constantly. The filming, which began in May 1978, dragged on for 56 weeks. It was supposed to take just 17. By the end, she was emotionally wrecked. And then came the scene that made film history. The baseball bat confrontation. Wendy, backing away from Jack, terrified, was shot 127 times over 3 full weeks. Shell's hands blistered. Her voice nearly vanished from screaming, and she lost 10 pounds. Jack Nicholson later said she looked like she was collapsing between takes. Kubrick, obsessed with precision, made them redo it for the smallest lighting changes. Shelley later told Roger, eared in 1980, that her hands were raw and her throat was burning. But she kept going because she wanted to get it right. That wasn't the only scene that took everything from her. For 9 months, Shelley cried for hours each day, sometimes for 12 hours straight. Her hair began to fall out. One day, she walked up to Kubrick and showed him a handful of it, saying, "See what you're doing to me?" She barely ate. She barely slept. And yet, she pushed through it all. In Vivian Kubrick's behind-the-scenes documentary from 1980, Shelley looks like a ghost, but she also looks determined. Years later, she would say it was the best performance of her life. For decades, people believed Kubrick had tormented her, but Shelley spent her final years telling a different story. In a 2021 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, she called Kubrick warm and friendly. They talked for hours about philosophy. Sometimes their conversations delayed the entire crew. She admitted the shoot was long. 13 months and exhausting, but she never called him cruel. She said she learned more from Kubrick than any other director she worked with. He helped her win an Emmy in 1984 for Fairy Tale Theater. They weren't enemies, they were collaborators. Complex, intense, but bonded by a shared goal. Even in 2022, Shelley was still setting the record straight. In one interview, she said, "We had a great relationship, actually, even though there were some differences from time to time. I knew Stanley loved me, period. She never denied the difficulty. She just wanted the world to understand that the pain was part of the process. She had days when her body gave up on her. She cried so much she dehydrated, but she wouldn't trade any of it. Not for anything." At 74, in what would become one of her final interviews, Shelley reflected on the madness, the myths, and the beauty of The Shining. She said she wouldn't change a thing. That film, no matter how brutal the process, had shaped her. Her death on July 11, 2024, marked the end of a life full of contradictions. She had been a rising star, a cultural icon, a recluse, a misunderstood soul, and in her last years, a woman finally reclaiming her story